My name is Elise, and I'm 19 years old. 19. That's supposed to be when life is just beginning, when you're discovering who you are, when the world feels full of possibility. But for me, 19 is the age when everything I knew was ripped away from me like flesh from bone. I still remember that night. God, how could I ever forget it? The night when my entire existence was shattered, when I was dragged kicking and screaming from the only world I'd ever known and thrown into a nightmare of power, politics, and primal fear. And it was all because of him. The Lycan King. King Edmund. The monster who looked at me with those cold gray eyes and growled those words that still echo in my nightmares. Don't hide from me. The way he said it, it wasn't a request. It was a command that froze the blood in my veins and made every instinct in my body scream to run, to hide, to disappear into nothingness where those eyes couldn't find me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that night, the night everything changed. The night I learned that being invisible wasn't enough to save you. The air in our village was suffocating that evening, thick with a tension so palpable you could taste it on your tongue like copper. The ancient ceremonial fires crackled and spat, sending shadows dancing across the faces of everyone gathered in the square. Everyone except me. I wasn't there. I was locked away in my small home, the one I'd shared with my mother for as long as I could remember, wrapped in layer upon layer of linen that smelled of lavender, my mother's favorite scent. She'd grown it in our tiny garden, tended to it with such care, and every piece of fabric in our home carried that gentle, soothing fragrance. But that night, not even the lavender could mask the bitter, acrid smell of fear that seemed to seep through the walls and settle in my lungs. I had no choice in any of it. None. That's what people don't understand about being an Omega. You don't get choices. You don't get a voice. You're a pawn in a game played by people who see you as less than human, as a tool to be used, a commodity to be traded. They were coming for me, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. My mother knew it. I knew it. The whole village knew it. The Lycan King's representatives were here for the selection ceremony, and no amount of hiding, no amount of praying, no amount of wishing I could simply cease to exist was going to change what was about to happen. I hadn't even attended the ceremony. Can you imagine that? I wasn't even there, and yet somehow, impossibly, I was chosen. Me, Elise. The awkward, trembling Omega who spent most of her life trying to be invisible, trying not to draw attention, trying not to exist too loudly because existence itself felt dangerous. The Lycan King had selected me as his potential bride. Me. Out of all the beautiful, strong, worthy women in our village and beyond, he chose the one who wasn't even brave enough to show her face at the ceremony. And just like that, my life as I knew it was over. Finished. Done. My future was no longer my own, not that it ever really had been, if I'm being honest. But this was different. This was being claimed by the most powerful, most feared creature in all the kingdoms. The Lycan King. The man, no, the beast, who ruled with absolute authority, whose word was law, whose very name made grown warriors tremble. If you want to know what happened next, if you want to understand how a terrified Omega girl survived being thrown into the den of the most dangerous predator alive, then stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't some fairy tale. This is my truth, raw and bloody and real. This is the story of how I lost everything and found something I never knew I was searching for. I need you to understand something about being an Omega. It's not just a status. It's not just a label. It's a prison that you're born into, chains that wrap around you before you even take your first breath. From the moment the midwife declared what I was, my entire life's trajectory was set in stone. I would never be strong. I would never be powerful. I would never matter. That's what everyone believed, what everyone knew, what everyone accepted as absolute truth. And for 19 years, I believed it too. I couldn't wrap my mind around it when they told me. Chosen to be his bride? It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. I was never the one to stand out. I was the one people looked at with pity, with sympathy that felt like acid on my skin. I was the Omega. The weak one. The one who would be married off to strengthen an alliance, to settle a debt, to be a gift passed from one hand to another like a piece of livestock. A burden to carry. That's all I'd ever been, all I'd ever expected to be. So why in God's name would the Lycan King choose me? The confusion was almost worse than the fear. Almost. Because the fear was all-consuming. It wrapped around my chest like iron bands, making every breath a struggle. It crawled up my throat and threatened to choke me. It turned my blood to ice and my bones to water. I was terrified in a way I'd never been before, and that's saying something because fear had been my constant companion for as long as I could remember. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that makes you wish you could claw your way out of your own skin, that makes you pray for death, because at least death would be an ending, a release. My mother tried to shield me from it all. God, she tried so hard. She was my protector, my fierce defender in a world that saw me as disposable. She'd spent my entire life fighting for me, speaking up for me when I was too scared to speak for myself, standing between me and a world that wanted to crush me beneath its heel. Her love was the only real thing I'd ever known, the only pure thing in a life filled with shame and degradation. But that night, even her fierce, mama bear love couldn't stop what was coming. I can still see her face when they came for me. The king's guards, massive men with eyes like chips of stone, standing in our doorway like harbingers of doom. My mother begged them. She actually got down on her knees, my proud, strong mother, and begged them to choose another girl. Anyone else. Please, not her baby. Not Elise. She's too young, too fragile, too innocent. The king would break her like a twig. Please, please, have mercy. But there is no mercy in the Lycan King's court. There is only power. And power doesn't care about a mother's tears or a frightened girl's trembling. They took me anyway. They pulled me from my mother's arms while she screamed and wailed, while I clung to her and sobbed, while everything I'd ever known was torn away from me. The last thing I saw as they dragged me out of our home was my mother collapsed on the floor, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that I could hear even as they pulled me farther and farther away. I've never forgiven them for that. I've never forgiven him for that. For making my mother suffer. For making her watch as they stole her only child. For the cruelty of it all. They put me in a carriage that smelled of pine and sweat and something else, something wild and animal that made my skin crawl. For 7 long days, we traveled. 7 days that felt like 7 years, 7 lifetimes, 7 eternities of hell. I barely slept, and when I did, nightmares plagued me, visions of teeth and claws and gray eyes that saw through me, that stripped away every defense and left me naked and exposed. I barely ate. The thought of food made my stomach turn. How could I eat when I was being taken to my doom? How could I sleep when every mile brought me closer to the monster who would claim me? The journey was torture. Pure, unrelenting torture. The carriage jolted and swayed, making me nauseated. The other passengers, guards and servants, ignored me for the most part, treating me like a piece of cargo to be delivered. And maybe that's all I was to them. A package. A delivery. The king's newest plaything to be presented and inspected and either accepted or discarded. Terror twisted my stomach into knots so tight I thought I might die from it. Honestly, there were moments when I wished I would. When I thought that death would be preferable to whatever waited for me at the end of this journey. I was going to the king's palace, the Lycan King's fortress, a place of legend and nightmare. What was I supposed to do there? What role was I supposed to play? Would he even look at me, or would he take one glance at this pathetic Omega and send me away in disgust? And if he did look at me, really look at me, what would he see? What would he want from me? The possibilities terrified me more than I can possibly express. It was on the 6th night of our journey that Clara first spoke to me. Really spoke to me, I mean, not just the perfunctory, drink this water or eat this bread that she'd been offering since we left. Clara was a beta, assigned to me as some kind of attendant or handler or keeper. I wasn't entirely sure of her role, honestly. She was older than me by maybe 10 years, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this nightmare. She sat down beside me in the carriage as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. "You're terrified," she said. It wasn't a question. She could see it written all over me, could probably smell it on my skin. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Everyone is at first," she continued, her voice gentle. "But it's not as bad as you think. Being chosen by the king, you're lucky, Elise. Lucky. The word made me want to laugh, or scream, or both. Lucky to be ripped from my home? Lucky to be claimed by a monster? Lucky to have my entire life destroyed? What kind of twisted definition of luck was that? But Clara wasn't scared of him. That's what struck me the most. She spoke about King Edmund, and even hearing his name made my heart race, with something that wasn't fear. Respect, maybe. Caution, certainly. But not the bone-deep terror that consumed me. She told me I was lucky, that being chosen wasn't as bad as I thought, that the king wasn't the monster legends made him out to be. But how could it not be as bad as I thought? How could the Lycan King be anything other than a ruthless predator? Everything I'd ever heard about him spoke of his power, his strength, his absolute dominion. He was feared by warriors and kings alike. He was the apex predator in a world of predators. And I was supposed to believe that being claimed by him was lucky? But then Clara said something that made me pause, that planted a seed of doubt in my mind. She said he was lonely. The Lycan King, feared by all, was a man burdened by his power, trapped in a life of solitude. He'd rejected every bride presented to him for years. Decades, even. Beautiful women, powerful women, women from the highest families and the strongest bloodlines, all rejected. He was waiting for something, Clara said. Searching for something. Someone who could see past the crown, past the power, past the legend. It made me wonder, despite my terror, despite my anger, despite everything, could he be more than the monster I had imagined? Could there be something human beneath all that power and fury? The thought was dangerous. I knew it was dangerous even as it formed in my mind. Because if I started to see him as something other than a monster, if I started to humanize him, then I was lost. Then I couldn't hate him purely, couldn't hold on to my anger like a shield. And my anger was all I had. My fear and my anger were the only things keeping me from completely falling apart. When we finally arrived at the palace, I thought my heart might actually stop. It was massive beyond comprehension, a fortress of stone and power that seemed to rise up and touch the sky. Towers reached toward the heavens like clawed fingers. Walls thick enough to withstand any siege. Guards everywhere, their eyes sharp and assessing. This was the seat of the Lycan King's power. This was where he ruled his kingdom with an iron fist. This was my new prison. They took me to a room, my room, they said, though calling it mine seemed like a cruel joke. It was beautiful, I'll give them that. More beautiful than any place I'd ever stayed. Silken curtains, a bed so soft it felt like sleeping on clouds, tapestries on the walls depicting scenes of hunts and battles and victories. But all I could see were the bars on the windows, subtle but there. All I could feel was the weight of the door when it closed behind me, locking me in. Beautiful cage or ugly cage, a cage is still a cage. They gave me time to rest, to bathe, to prepare myself. Servants came and went, bringing food I couldn't eat, clothes I didn't want to wear, kindnesses I couldn't accept because accepting them felt like accepting my fate. I wanted to rage. I wanted to scream and throw things and demand they take me home. But I was too terrified to even raise my voice. So I sat there, in that beautiful prison, and waited for the inevitable moment when I would be brought before him. Before the king. Before my doom. That moment came sooner than I was ready for. Which is to say, it came at all, because I would never have been ready. Not in 1,000 years. Not in 1,000,000 lifetimes. When I first met him, when I was finally brought before King Edmund, the Lycan King himself, I thought my legs might give out beneath me. I'd been terrified before, God knows I'd spent days drowning in terror, but this was different. This was standing in the presence of a force of nature, a creature of such raw power that the air around him seemed to crackle with it. He was taller than any man I had ever seen, his frame massive and imposing. Muscles rippled beneath his clothing with every slight movement. He had a commanding presence that made me want to shrink back, to hide, to disappear. Everything about him screamed predator, danger, power. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. Gray eyes, the color of storm clouds, cold and assessing as they swept over me. He looked at me the way a wolf looks at prey, sizing me up, deciding if I was worth the effort to chase down. I felt naked under that gaze, stripped of every defense, every pretense. He saw right through me, saw every weakness, every fear, every desperate thought racing through my mind. His eyes held mine, and I couldn't look away even though every instinct screamed at me to drop my gaze, to submit, to show my throat and pray he'd make it quick. He stepped closer, and I actually stepped back. I couldn't help it. My body moved on instinct, trying to maintain distance from this predator even though there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a hunter who'd found exactly what he was looking for. "Elise," he said, and hearing my name in his deep, rumbling voice sent shivers down my spine. "You didn't attend the ceremony." It wasn't a question, but I felt compelled to answer anyway. "No, Your Majesty," I managed to whisper, hating how weak my voice sounded, how it shook with fear. "And yet, you were the only one I wanted to see." His words made no sense. They couldn't make sense. How could he want to see me when I hadn't even been there? How could he choose me when he'd never laid eyes on me? But I didn't dare question him. I just stood there, trembling like a leaf in a storm, waiting for whatever would come next. His gaze never left me. It was unrelenting, burning into me, making me feel things I didn't understand and didn't want to name. As he stepped even closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of him, pine and earth, and something wild, something else stirred inside me. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. Because along with the terror, along with the desperate urge to flee, there was something else. A pull. A draw. An attraction that made absolutely no sense and terrified me almost as much as the man himself. His presence, his authority, it terrified me, yes. God, yes, it terrified me down to my very soul. But it also intrigued me in a way I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Why? Why was I drawn to him despite everything? Despite my fear, despite my anger, despite knowing that he was dangerous and powerful and could crush me without a second thought? What was wrong with me that I felt this magnetic pull toward the very thing that should repel me? I hated myself for it. Hated my traitorous body for responding to his nearness. Hated the way my heart raced when he looked at me, and I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else entirely. Hated that some small, irrational part of me wanted to step closer instead of backing away. The court was a nightmare unto itself. After that first meeting with the king, I was introduced to his court, and I quickly learned that the Lycan King wasn't the only predator I needed to fear. The court was like nothing I had ever seen or imagined. Lords and ladies in their finery, all of them beautiful and powerful and so far above my station that I might as well have been an insect. Guards standing at attention, their faces impassive, but their eyes missing nothing. Advisors whispering in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever I came near. And all of them, every single one of them, casting judgment on me without ever speaking a word. I could see it in their eyes. The disdain, the confusion, the outright hostility. They looked at me and wondered what the king could possibly see in this pathetic Omega. They looked at me and found me wanting. And honestly, I agreed with them. I looked at myself through their eyes and saw exactly what they saw, a weak, trembling girl who had no business being here, who didn't belong in this world of power and politics and deadly games. Lord Raven was the worst of them. A powerful alpha, tall and broad and handsome in that cruel, sharp way that some men are. He had his own daughter in mind as the king's bride, Serena, a beautiful alpha female who was everything I wasn't. Strong where I was weak. Confident where I was terrified. Powerful where I was powerless. She was the obvious choice, the right choice, the choice that made sense. And both she and her father made it abundantly clear that they thought my presence was a joke, an insult, a mistake that would be corrected soon enough. Serena looked at me with such open contempt that it made my skin crawl. She didn't even try to hide it, didn't bother with false politeness or veiled insults. She just stared at me with those cold eyes and let me see exactly how worthless she thought I was. And her father? Lord Raven watched me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. I could practically see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating how to get rid of me and install his daughter in my place. But what they didn't know, what I didn't know until Clara told me, was that Serena had already been rejected. She'd been presented to the king years ago, and he'd sent her away without a second glance. She was nothing compared to me, at least in the king's eyes. Though for the life of me, I couldn't understand why. What did he see in me that he hadn't seen in her? What could I possibly offer that she couldn't offer 100 times over? Clara pulled me aside one evening, after a particularly brutal day at court where I'd endured hours of barely concealed mockery and outright hostility. We were in my chambers, my beautiful prison, and she sat down beside me, her expression serious. "Elise, you need to understand something," she said quietly. "The king has been rejecting brides for longer than you've been alive. Beautiful women, powerful women, women from the highest families, all rejected. Do you know why?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Because he was waiting. Searching for something specific. Someone who could see him, really see him, not just the crown and the power. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge him, to stand up to him, to be his equal rather than his subject. "But I am afraid," I whispered. "I'm terrified of him." Clara smiled sadly. "Fear and respect aren't the same thing. You're afraid, yes. But you're also here. You're surviving. You're standing your ground even when everything in you wants to run. That's what he sees. That's what he's been waiting for." Her words planted another seed of doubt, another crack in the wall of pure hatred and fear I'd been trying to build around my heart. Could she be right? Was the king really waiting for me? Had he chosen me not in spite of my weakness, but because of something he saw beneath it? The thought was terrifying in a whole new way. Because if it was true, then I had power I didn't know about, influence I didn't understand. And power was dangerous. Power got people killed. Despite my terror, despite my determination to keep my distance and guard my heart, I found myself drawn into the king's orbit in ways I couldn't escape. He sought me out. Not constantly, not overwhelmingly, but regularly enough that I couldn't avoid him. He would summon me to dine with him, to walk in the gardens with him, to sit by the fire in his private chambers and talk. Talk. Can you imagine? The Lycan King wanted to talk to me. About what, you ask? About everything. About nothing. About my life before, my mother, my fears and dreams and thoughts. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He looked at me like I mattered, like my words had weight and meaning. It was disorienting. Terrifying. And despite myself, despite everything, a tiny part of me started to enjoy it. One evening, we were sitting by the fire in his chambers. It had become something of a routine, though I'd never agreed to it, never said yes to these meetings. He just summoned me, and I came because what choice did I have? But this night was different. This night, his eyes were softer than they had ever been. The hardness, the predatory gleam that usually lurked there had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. "Do you hate it here?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. The question caught me off guard. Hate it? Of course I hated it. I hated every second of being here, being away from my mother, being trapped in this gilded cage. But looking at him in that moment, seeing something in his face that looked almost like pain, the words stuck in my throat. "I don't belong here," I finally said, which was true without being a direct answer. "Perhaps you belong here more than you know," he replied. "Perhaps you're the only one who truly belongs here." I didn't understand what he meant. How could I belong in a place so far removed from everything I'd ever known? How could I belong beside a man, a king, a legend, a monster who wielded such absolute power? But then he started to talk, really talk, about things I don't think he'd ever told anyone. About the loneliness of power. About how every person who approached him wanted something: power, favor, alliance, protection. About how he could trust no one because everyone had an agenda. About how the crown he wore was both his greatest strength and his deepest prison. About how he'd been searching for someone who could see past all of it, who could see him not as the Lycan King, but just as Edmund. Just as a man. And for the first time, I saw the king not as a ruler, not as a predator, not as the monster of my nightmares, but as a man. A man who, just like me, had been forced into a life he didn't choose. A man who was trapped by expectations and duty and the weight of responsibility that would crush most people. A man who was lonely in a way that went bone deep, soul deep, in a way that power and wealth and authority could never fill. It changed something in me, that conversation. It didn't erase my fear, nothing could do that, but it complicated it. It added layers and nuances that made everything harder, more confusing, more painful. Because hating a monster is easy. But seeing the humanity in someone, seeing their pain and loneliness and vulnerability, that makes everything harder. The biggest shock came a few weeks into my stay at the palace. There was to be a grand ball, a celebration of something or other. Honestly, the nobility seemed to find any excuse to throw lavish parties. I hadn't planned to attend. Why would I? I had no place at such an event, no role to play. I was just the king's current pet project, the Omega he'd inexplicably chosen and would inevitably discard once he came to his senses. But then he came to my chambers himself. Not a servant with a message. Not Clara with instructions. The king himself, standing in my doorway like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You'll need a dress," he said without preamble. "For the ball tonight." "I'm not attending," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, you are." It wasn't a request. It was a command. "I don't dance," I said desperately, grasping at any excuse. "I don't know how." "I'll embarrass you." Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement? Challenge? Then I'll teach you. Now. We have a few hours. And just like that, I found myself in his arms, his hand at my waist, his other hand holding mine, as he guided me through the steps of a formal dance. It was surreal. Terrifying. His nearness made it hard to breathe, hard to think. But as we moved together, as he patiently corrected my steps and guided me through the movements, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. A awareness. A connection. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely horrible. That night at the ball, he surprised everyone when he invited me to dance. Not just invited, he made it his first dance of the evening. In front of the entire court, in front of all the lords and ladies who looked down on me, in front of Serena and Lord Raven, and everyone who thought I was unworthy, he chose me. He led me onto the dance floor, and we moved together like we'd been doing it for years instead of hours. It wasn't just a dance. It was a statement. A declaration. He was telling everyone in that room that he saw me. Not as a potential queen, not as a political pawn, but as someone who could stand beside him. As his equal, at least in that moment. And despite everything, despite my fear, despite my anger, despite my conviction that this would all end in disaster, I felt something bloom in my chest. Something warm and terrifying and precious. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. I was changing, and I didn't know how to stop it. The scared Omega who had arrived at the palace weeks ago was still there, still trembling and uncertain. But she was joined by someone new. Someone bolder. Someone who was tired of being afraid all the time, tired of cowering and hiding and making herself small. Someone who was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to take up space in the world. It started small. Little moments of defiance. Speaking my mind when I disagreed with something, even if it was the king I was disagreeing with. Holding my ground when the court ladies tried to intimidate me. Meeting their disdainful looks with my chin raised instead of ducked. It felt dangerous and exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The king noticed. Of course he noticed. And instead of putting me in my place, instead of reminding me of my station, he encouraged it. He challenged me to speak my mind. He asked for my opinions and actually listened to them. He treated me like I had value, like my thoughts mattered, like I was worth listening to. One night, after another formal dinner where I'd openly disagreed with one of his advisors about a policy matter, he pulled me aside. "You're not afraid of me anymore," he observed. "I'm terrified of you," I corrected. "I'm just tired of letting that fear control me." He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Good. Fear is healthy. It keeps you careful. But letting it paralyze you? That's when fear becomes your prison. And you should know about prisons," I said boldly, before I could stop myself. "Even if yours is made of gold and power instead of iron bars." For a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. His eyes flashed with something I couldn't read. But then he laughed, a real laugh that I'd never heard from him before. "You see me," he said softly. "You actually see me." And that's when I realized the terrifying truth. I did see him. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing the Lycan King and started seeing Edmund. The man beneath the crown. The lonely soul trapped by duty and power. The person who was just as much a prisoner as I was, even if his cage was more gilded than mine. But seeing him, really seeing him, was dangerous. Because once you see someone, once you understand them, it becomes so much harder to hate them. And I needed to hate him. I needed that anger, that resentment, that fury at being taken from my home, and my mother, and everything I knew. Without it, what did I have to protect myself? What armor could I wear against the feelings that were growing inside me, feelings I didn't want to name or acknowledge? I challenged him that night. Not just in private, but in front of his council. They were discussing policy, something about taxes on the outer villages, increasing the burden on people who were already struggling. People like my mother, like everyone I'd grown up with. And I couldn't stay silent. Those people can barely survive as it is, I said, my voice cutting through the council chamber. Every head turned to stare at me. And Omega, speaking out of turn in the king's council. It was unheard of. Unthinkable. Increasing their taxes won't just hurt them. It'll destroy them. You'll be killing your own people for a few more coins in your treasury. The silence was deafening. Lord Raven's face turned purple with rage. Other council members looked shocked, appalled, furious. How dare this Omega speak to them this way? How dare she question their wisdom? But the king looked at me with something that might have been pride. She makes a valid point, he said calmly. Perhaps we should reconsider this proposal. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. For the first time in my life, I had spoken up and someone had listened. Not just someone, the most powerful man in the kingdom. I had challenged him, challenged his counsel, and instead of being punished, I was heard. I was no longer just the shy Omega hiding in the shadows. I was becoming someone else. Someone stronger. Someone who could stand beside the Lycan King not as a trembling victim, but as his equal, at least in that moment. And that terrified me more than anything else had, because it meant I was losing the one identity I'd always known. If I wasn't the scared Omega, then who was I? But the court wasn't going to let me rise without a fight. The council's judgment was harsh and unrelenting. They tested me, prodded me for weaknesses, pushed me to see how far they could go before I broke. Lord Raven led the charge, of course, with Serena at his side. They made it their mission to prove I was unworthy, to demonstrate to the king that he'd made a terrible mistake. One day, they called me before the full council for what they termed an evaluation. It was a trial in all but name, a chance for them to publicly humiliate me and show the king just how unsuitable I was to be his bride. They asked me about policy, about history, about matters of state that an Omega from a small village would never have been taught. They wanted me to fail, to show my ignorance, to prove that I didn't belong. And yes, there was much I didn't know. Much I'd never been taught. But I refused to let them see me cower. You're right, I said when they pointed out my lack of formal education. I don't know the intricacies of trade agreements or the history of border disputes. I wasn't raised in a palace. I was raised in a village where we worried about having enough food to eat, where we struggled to survive while nobles played their games of power. So no, I can't quote ancient treaties. But I know what it's like to go hungry. I know what it's like to watch your mother work herself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over your head. I know what your policies feel like from the other side, from the side of the people you're supposed to be serving. And maybe that knowledge is worth something too. The silence that followed was electric. Some council members looked furious. Others looked thoughtful. Lord Raven looked like he wanted to strike me down where I stood. But I stood my ground. I would not back down. Not anymore. I'd spent my whole life backing down, making myself smaller, apologizing for existing. No more. If they were going to reject me, it would be because of who I truly was, not because I'd failed to be someone I wasn't. Serena took a different approach. She was all false sweetness and veiled threats. She cornered me one day in the gardens, her smile sharp as a knife. You know this can't last, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The king is fascinated by you now because you're novel, different. But that will fade. It always does. And when it does, where will you be? You'll be discarded, sent away in disgrace, while someone suitable takes their rightful place at his side. She made her intentions clear. She thought she was the better choice, and in many ways, she was right. She was powerful, beautiful, well-educated, politically connected. Everything I wasn't. But in that moment, looking at her perfect, cruel face, I realized something. She didn't see the king. She saw the crown, the power, the throne. She wanted to be queen, not to be his partner. And that was the difference between us. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I'll be discarded. But at least when he looks at me, he sees a person, not a ladder to climb. Her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the fury beneath. But before she could respond, before she could unleash whatever venom she'd been preparing, the king appeared. He'd been watching, listening. And the look on his face when he turned to Serena was colder than I'd ever seen it. "Lady Serena," he said, his voice like ice. "I believe our conversation is over. Leave. Now." She tried to salvage the situation, tried to smile and play it off as friendly banter, but he wasn't having it. He dismissed her without another word, making it abundantly clear where his loyalty lay. When she was gone, he turned to me. "She tried to manipulate you, to make you doubt yourself." "I know," I said, "but I'm not as easy to manipulate as she thought." He smiled at that. "No, you're not. You're stronger than anyone gives you credit for. Stronger than you give yourself credit for." His words wrapped around my heart and squeezed. Because I was starting to believe them. Starting to believe that maybe I wasn't just a weak Omega after all. Maybe I was something more. Something worth keeping. The final decision came after weeks of political maneuvering, council debates, and Serena's increasingly desperate attempts to discourage me. The king was supposed to announce his choice at the end of the traditional trial period, 60 days, to evaluate potential brides and make his selection. But he didn't wait that long. It was during another council meeting, one where Lord Raven was once again pushing his daughter's suitability, that the king stood up and silenced the room with a single gesture. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I've heard your arguments. I've listened to your concerns. And I've made my choice." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment when I would either be claimed or discarded, when my fate would be sealed one way or another. "Elise," he said, and his eyes found mine across the council chamber. "Come here." I walked to him on trembling legs, hyper-aware of every eye in the room on me. When I reached him, he took my hand in his, and I felt the warmth of his skin, the strength in his grip. "This woman," he said, addressing the council while looking at me, "has shown more courage, more honesty, more strength in these past weeks than anyone else I've ever met. She challenges me. She sees me. She stands her ground even when she's terrified. She speaks truth to power even when it would be easier and safer to stay silent. And that is exactly what I need. What this kingdom needs." He turned back to the council. "Elise will be my bride. My queen. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to challenge me directly." No one spoke. No one dared. Lord Raven looked apoplectic, but even he wasn't foolish enough to directly challenge the Lycan King. Serena had gone pale, her perfect mask finally cracking to reveal the devastation beneath. And me? I was stunned. Overwhelmed. I finally understood why I had been chosen. Not because of my Omega status, not because of my bloodline, not because of anything to do with politics or power. But because I was me. Because in a world where everyone wore masks and played games, I had been real. Honest. Myself, even when it was terrifying to be so. King Edmund needed someone who could see beyond the crown. Someone who would challenge him, question him, keep him grounded in the reality of what his power meant for real people. Someone who wasn't afraid to tell him the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. And somehow, impossibly, I had become that person. With all the pressure from the council, from Serena, from the weight of tradition and expectation, he chose me. His bride. His queen. But more importantly, his equal. At least, he saw me that way. And maybe, just maybe, I was starting to see myself that way too. We were united in a ceremony that blended old traditions with new promises. It wasn't just about duty or politics or securing alliances. It was about two people who had found something real between us, something that had grown in the spaces between fear and power, between loneliness and connection. A bond forged in truth, in respect, in mutual understanding. I won't lie and say all my fears disappeared. I won't pretend that everything was suddenly perfect, that I wasn't still terrified sometimes, that I didn't still wake up in the middle of the night wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The anger was still there too, lurking beneath everything else. Anger at being taken from my home. Anger at a world that had treated me as less than human for so long. Anger at the pain my mother must be feeling, thinking she'd lost me forever. But I was also transformed. I was no longer the scared Omega hiding in the shadows, making herself small, apologizing for existing. I had found my place beside the Lycan King, and together, we would face whatever challenges lay ahead. I had found my voice, my strength, my power. I had learned that weakness and strength aren't opposites, that you can be terrified and brave at the same time, that vulnerability can be a strength rather than a weakness. I made Edmund promise that I could see my mother again, that she would know I was safe and, against all odds, happy. He agreed without hesitation, arranging for her to be brought to the palace with honor and respect. When we were reunited, when I held my mother again and told her everything that had happened, I saw the relief in her eyes. And the pride. She was proud of me, of who I'd become, of the strength I'd found. No longer hidden, no longer afraid, or at least, no longer letting fear control me, I stood beside my king. Together, we would rewrite the rules of power, one choice at a time. We would build a kingdom where Omegas weren't seen as less than, where power wasn't just about domination but about service, where strength meant protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. It won't be easy. Change never is. There are still those in the court who resent me, who wait for me to fail, who believe I'm unworthy of my position. And they're right to be skeptical, in a way. I am unworthy, not because I'm weak, but because no one person should have that much power, that much influence. But I'll do my best. I'll keep speaking truth even when it's uncomfortable. I'll keep seeing Edmund as a man, not just a king, and I'll keep him grounded in the reality of what his choices mean for real people. This is my story. The story of how a terrified Omega became a queen. How pain and anger transformed into strength and purpose. How fear gave way to courage, not because the fear disappeared, but because I learned to act despite it. How I lost everything I knew and found something I never knew I needed. My name is Elise. I'm 19 years old. And I'm the Lycan King's bride, his queen, his equal. This is just the beginning of a tale that will keep unfolding, one challenge at a time, one day at a time, one brave choice at a time. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, if you've felt my pain and my fear and my slow, terrifying transformation, then you understand. You understand that strength doesn't always look like power, that courage doesn't always look like confidence, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to let fear make you small. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my journey from victim to survivor to something more, something I'm still learning to name and claim as my own. This is just the beginning. There's so much more ahead, so many more challenges to face, so many more ways I'll need to find strength I don't know if I have. But I'm not alone anymore. I have Edmund. I have Clara. I have my mother, safe and honored in the palace. I have my own newfound strength, fragile and uncertain as it sometimes feels. And I have my anger, my pain, my fear not as chains holding me back, but as fuel pushing me forward, reminding me why this matters, why I can't give up, why I have to keep fighting for a better world. No longer hidden. No longer silent. No longer willing to be small. This is who I am now. This is who I'm becoming. And I'm terrified. But I'm also ready.